next week's.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Larry.
Would you like an introduction?
So it's my distinct pleasure today to introduce today's speaker, John Gastil. John's a professor of communication at the University of Washington, and he's also a fellow small group communication scholar. John's research focuses on political decision-making contexts in particular, and it's centered around the concept of deliberative democracy. Deliberative democracy includes three different elements. The first one is face-to-face deliberation among citizens in public institutions. The second is a deliberative mass media and electoral process. And the third is a larger set of cultural norms promoting deliberation as an essential mode of discourse. Professor Gastil has written 6 books on the topic, and actually 2 just came out last year in 2010. The Group in Society was published by Sage, and The Jury and Democracy, How Jury Deliberations Promote Civic Engagement and Political Participation. That's a mouthful, John. That was published by Oxford University Press. Before I turn the floor over to today's speaker, I'd like to share a fun fact about John with you. And actually, he approved this one. So it's okay for me to share it with all of you. So one of the things I like to do is find out how people got interested in their topic of study. And John shared with me that the way he got interested in small groups was through countless hours as an adolescent playing Dungeons and Dragons. So group role-playing game, I see a lot of nods. How many of you are also, I mean, there were a number of you, how many fellow Dungeons and Dragons? Okay.
Yeah, you just found out how many will admit it.
Oh, yeah.
It's 5 times that figure.
So anyway, do you have any guess what his role was? He played the same role in Dungeons and Dragons. Any guess?
Eric?
Yeah!
Yes! Bingo! You win the prize.
Could you explain that?
Oh, no.
Okay, anyway. So that's a small fact. So anyway, before I turn it over, I just wanted to introduce your topic today, and it's right here. But this project that he's going to be talking about was funded by the National Science Foundation. And the title of the project is Investigating the Electoral Impact and Deliberation of the Oregon Citizens Initiative Review. And so with that, I turn the floor over to you. So let's give John a warm Annenberg welcome.
Thank you so much. That welcome felt indeed warm. Coming from Seattle, just about anything warm. So for those of you not steeped on the essential details of Dungeons and Dragons, the cleric is the character in the party who aspires to a higher wisdom. And that's the sort of academic joke is you want that character because the magic user who has high intelligence is always kind of a jerk. If you're not getting the D&D references, fear not. You've all seen Lord of the Rings, and there is the Eye of Sauron right there. It's the masterful gaze of people's oversight from your Russian poster. And if that doesn't make you excited to live in the Soviet Union, I don't know what does. Perhaps the spotlight also would make you feel secure, knowing that every movement is being watched. I'll make my last reference to your completely awesome collection of Soviet-era posters to say, looking at the sort of goofus and gallant one there that has the salmon and gray contrast in Good and Bad Daughter. My goal, like the Good Daughter, is to lessen Granny's tedium. That is what the Good Daughter does in the evening by reading to her most nights. I like just the honesty that apparently being Granny in the Soviet Union is tedious. And that can only be lessened by having your daughter read to you, presumably books that are not censored. So I got a laugh. I wasn't sure what would. I thought Eye of Sauron would kill, but apparently Soviet censorship jokes are cute. So let's go ahead and roll on in here. Here's the exciting thing about this talk, honestly, is this Oregon Citizens Initiative review you're going to hear about just happened. Just happened. It just led into the November election. And There's a few folks at the University of Washington, including Wen Lean, who was working with me at the time when this thing was getting started, and some other graduate students, and a few other folks. Certainly Oregonians know about it, but internationally it's just not well known. Even nationally it's not well known. You are probably going to be getting a great sort of cocktail conversation anecdote. And it's really a remarkable thing that the state of Oregon did. So I hope you can appreciate that you really are learning about something exceptional, and it may be something that becomes relatively common and widespread, potentially, is the reason we can talk about it. I have to give some props quickly to just an appreciation to the fellow colleagues from various universities who have helped out with the project, many grad students. Undergraduates have been actually helping with some work on the transcripts. Ned Crosby gets a special shout out. He created a process called the Citizens Jury in the 1970s, and it really is the origin of this Oregon CIR process. And then two guys, a couple masters in public policy, Tyrone Redmond and Elliot Shuford of Healthy Democracy Oregon. They're the ones who actually lobbied and got a law passed in Oregon that made this whole thing possible. The National Science Foundation and QGov, they funded the research project, the sort of evaluation component. The actual establishment of the Oregon CIR is an Oregon state law that was accomplished through a political process, something that Ned Crosby tried in Washington and did not succeed. But these two enterprising civic reformers got the legislature to go for it. And I'll come back to that at the end because it was a one-year project subject to sunsetting, and it's now sunsetted. And we just testified this last month to the Oregon legislature about the project and our research, and they are now discussing whether to renew it. So I'll try to come back to that at the end, about the fate of the CIR process. So where we're going to go today. I'll say just a little bit about deliberative democratic theory. I don't want to linger there too long, but I'll define the term that we're going to use about 1,000 times. I hope you find that useful. I'll talk about connecting micro and macro. I appreciated in the introduction how I conceptualized deliberation was described eloquently, and I actually want to know the citation for that, because that was pretty good. It is these different levels, but the combinations of those levels is often difficult. Getting small group face-to-face deliberation to be meaningful to a macro level, large-scale process like an election is no mean feat. And I think in Oregon they have successfully made that connection, but that's part of what we'll talk about, the theory of how you would do that. The bulk of our time will be in what I'd like to just call an evaluation project of the Oregon CIR. There really are theoretical questions and some hypotheses built in there, but it really is asking, what was the quality of the deliberation that took place in this process? Ultimately, the deliberations among the small group of citizens creates a statement that goes in the official voter's guide. Did people see that? Did they even know that it happened? There's lots of things in voters' guides. I'm from San Diego, I know about the California voters' guide. That thing's a phone book. Well, in Oregon, very similar. One important difference is the pro and con arguments that come after the initiative itself are just bought and paid for, literally. I mean, you buy space, and it's cheap. So it's just loaded with stuff, not much of which is terribly helpful. And then finally, is there an impact? So people might have seen it, but did it actually influence them? Did it give them any knowledge or cause them to pause and have any reflection? In other words, did the small group deliberation through this statement wind up influencing the macro public? Right? Those are the three key questions we'll be looking at, with the strongest emphasis really in the end on the third of those. And then finally, a few reflections at the end. All right. So a couple words about deliberative democratic theory. Again, I don't want to spend too much time here. I'm happy to talk endlessly about this with anyone who's interested. But let's just start with the definition of this term here. What is deliberation? So I go with something like this. When people deliberate, they carefully examine a problem and arrive at a well-reasoned solution after a period of inclusive, respectful consideration of diverse points of view. One of the things I like to say is that when you talk about democratic deliberation, there's sort of two parts. There's the analytic part, the deliberative part. Are you deliberating? Are you doing a rigorous process of problem analysis, weighing pros and cons, and so on? You can be very rigorous without being democratic, though. That second part of the definition is more about the democratic part. Equal opportunities for participation, mutual respect, consideration, and so on. You put those two together, and you might have yourself a pretty good process. It would be a democratic deliberative process. It doesn't have to be face-to-face. That's what I've tended to study. In the case of our study, this term, though, will really be existing on two levels. As you read it right here, it probably sounds like a face-to-face discussion. That works great. But it also can refer to a macro-level process. We can ask ourselves, when we voted on the initiative in California, let's say on medical marijuana, or on marijuana legalization, I should say, Did we as a state, as a public, as a voting public, do you want to deliberate? Did we carefully examine? Did we respectfully consider, and so on? So that term is deliberately abstract enough that it can apply to multiple levels of analysis. I know many of you are familiar with the idea that there is a body of scholarship on public deliberation, but for those of you not as familiar, I'd like to sometimes put up this timeline, which Jason Gilmore, one of our grad students, recently updated for me. This is just a search and expanded academic index on how many articles pair the word deliberation with civic, citizen, political, public. You basically get this pairing. You're more or less talking about deliberative democracy and such things. And you can see, 1989, I entered grad school, and that's just talk about fortuitous. Timing matters in grad school. Trying to figure out what's on the ground. There was almost nothing. In 1991, I went to the Kettering Foundation, a civic foundation in Ohio for the summer, and I met all these people talking about deliberation and democracy, and I thought, oh my God, there's more. There's not just these two people I wrote to, Ben Barber and Jane Mansford. Didn't write to Jürgen Habermas, I had no German at the time, but, it's another story, but there wasn't much out there. There was literally just, 1, 2, 3, 4 articles at that time. Since then, it was a good stock to invest in. It was the Google of topics. And it's been very favorable. I sold short right about here. No, I'm out. No, it's really been growing. I mean, there are hundreds of articles now every year. Some of these articles are kind of being repurposed to sound like they're about deliberative democracy, but for the most part, they are about it. And it is a very broad term that actually helps reframe and reorganize lots of familiar things. So that's perfectly legitimate. It gives you a sense for the growth of the field and really a lot of excitement in this area.
Can I ask a quick question
Please.
about that? What fields
Sure, are in there?
are in there?
There's a guy at Colorado State University, Martin Carcassonne, has done this crazy sort of wheel of connections to deliberation, and it's everything. The heart is political science and communication, but it just doesn't stop. It's public affairs, it's sociology, it's psychology, social psychology, environmental studies, and education, and on and on. Everybody who kind of touches it finds something that maybe it helps them think about it a different way. It started really as a moral philosophical perspective, right? An alternative conception of democracy that wanted to place more emphasis not just on raw participation, but on the quality of that participation, the nature of it. And then it became kind of empirical a little bit, and now it's empirical a lot. Everything from field studies, mostly case studies, to some experimental work. But yeah, lots of people are finding that it's an interesting way of thinking about familiar topics, and it's certainly an alternative approach to democracy. All right, connecting micro and macro. I told you, we can think about, I told you, sound like a Soviet poster, I told you, that we can think about deliberation at different levels of analysis. So let's talk through that just a little bit more, and I'll have my self-promotional moment here. So micro-level group deliberation, well-structured designs, things like the deliberative poll, the national issues forum, citizens' juries, consensus conferences. There's so many of these things. Many of them are described in the Deliberative Democracy Handbook, which was co-edited with Peter Levine. Many people have said, boy, that's the best book you've ever written. I edited it, so that's kind of a dig. But what are you going to do? Anyway, I love that joke. It's true. People say that. Oh, it's such a great book. Yeah, thanks. I think I helped with the intro. Anyway, there's really some really remarkable designs for deliberation. That gives you a sense of some of them, but that was 2005, and there's actually been a lot more since then, such as the one in Oregon. They tend to lack legitimacy or authority. They tend to be kind of experimental processes. We're going to try this over here, try this over there. Wouldn't it be interesting if we had a conversation about this policy? What would happen? Maybe it's advisory. The jury in democracy, and the long title just makes it more searchable. The jury in democracy is really emphasizing, we actually have an existing deliberative citizen institution that we completely take for granted. One of the more famous critics of deliberative democracy is Judge Richard Posner, who, and I don't know if this is apocryphal, but he was once giving a talk where he's reputed to have said, look, if deliberative democracy, having everyday citizens involved in governance in this way was such a great idea, surely we would have built at least one institution of that nature, right? And when someone answered, excuse me, Your Honor, what would you count the jury as? And the answer was, an exception, apparently. But you gotta love. Oh, I guess it takes two to be wrong. The jury really is a remarkable deliberative body in so many ways. We're not here to praise it for long today, but I emphasize it because it actually is quite different from most deliberative experiments, which really don't have the authority and the legitimacy of the jury. The Oregon CIR, however, does have an interesting kind of power, and we'll get to that. So, all right, that's micro level. Great, so you can have a jury. Yeah, that's conceivable. We've done that. But what about macro level? Well, people in elections tend to have limited, sustained contact with opposing views. There's a mix of low issue knowledge, and unfortunately, the things we do tend to know are often systematically distorted. Working with a couple of grad students at Washington, it's hilarious to see that the people who are sort of most knowledgeable on an issue that might be on your ballot this year are people who are strong partisans and are politically sophisticated. That is, they know things like who's on the Supreme Court and how many years a senator is in office. Those people actually know the most. Did I mention that the things they know are wrong? And they're wrong in the direction you would predict. That is, the conservatives know one set of things and the liberals know the opposite. And God bless the moderates. One of our grad students did a dissertation to see if maybe they became the most knowledgeable because they actually need to know something. Well, no, actually they become the most humble. They basically say, I don't know. I don't know. I can't even guess. Leave me alone. I don't know. And maybe that's a step up from the certainty that is a systematic distortion. In any case, when I wrote by popular demand about 10 years ago, my thought was, and I'd worked on campaigns, so I had no illusions that we would create a deliberating day. There would be no deliberation day, as Jim Fishkin and Bruce Ackerman had advocated. But I thought, voters do want reliable voting queues. They are in a hurry and they want to get their choice right. They don't just want to fill out their ballot. They actually care. But they need reliable voting queues. They need someplace they can go to maybe help them make up their mind, or if they're just a little lazier, just have someone give them a good suggestion, but someone they can trust. And I think there's lots of room here for interesting work on social networking and so on. Could people build up networks of trust that would help them fill out their ballots in a more systematic way? I think that's a great underdeveloped area. If you're interested in that, you might Google Living Voters Guide. It's a project at Washington that's still very, very prototypical, but in an early prototype stage, I mean. But it's interesting. Anyway, in my popular demand, what I wound up advocating was, well, why don't we have random samples of citizens actually study issues, and then their analysis would go in the voting guide. Actually, at the time I published this book comes out in 2000. Think sort of mid to late 2000. Think about an election that might be happening about that time. And here's how you might distill my argument, because I want these things on the ballot. Here's the gist of my argument. Wouldn't it be better if we made ballots more complicated? So anyway, my favorite review of this book was in, it was either HAPS or American Political Science Review, where the reviewer basically said, this guy's crazy. This idea is completely outlandish. No one would ever do these random panels and all that. But he's kind of honest. And he's actually not sure if they would work. He actually has a little research plan for it. So God bless him. I thought, that's not a bad review. It is a little bit crazy. It's a little utopian. I listened to the rock band Utopia in the 70s and 80s. Todd Rundgren, wonderful band. But, yeah, at least I'm honest. A utopian, but kind of aware that most utopian communities end in sort of disaster. Yeah. So, nonetheless, at the end of the book, I said, if there's one way maybe we could get these random panels instituted, it would be on the initiative process or referenda. Because even if you don't want these random panels analyzing candidates, come on. How about the issues themselves? That's why we're really asking voters to actually make policy decisions. And if you look at the map out here in the West, we know all about these things because we have initiatives in referenda. Historical reasons for that. But the point being, actually, if you look around the country, people actually are voting directly on policy questions all over the country. They sometimes forget that they're doing so at a local level for bonding and so on. So we're being asked fiscal and policy questions all the time in this country. Maybe we can use some help. And that, I thought, was the best sort of point of entry. Well, the Voters Pamphlet does provide assistance, right? I mean, maybe that's all we need. After all, it tells us a little bit about what's going on different issues. Gives us a sort of maybe the Attorney General's assessment of what the initiative would do. There's an estimate of fiscal impact and so on. Maybe that's enough. Well, I don't think it is. People do read these things. There's not as much research on them as you might guess. People do read them, though. but they don't necessarily know what to make of them. And you'll see some really interesting data about how they use conventional voting guide elements in a little bit. No, I want that deliberative voting queue. I want something better than the conventional voting guide. I want to have a voting queue that has these features. First of all, I want it to be created through a deliberative process. So that page in your voter's guide comes about from real, honest reflection on the issue, hearing both sides and really thinking it through. I want it to be visible. I don't want it to just be a deliberative process that happens and then disappears. In the state of Washington, when we had a legislative hearing on this, one of the more libertarian members said, look, you can just have a public forum where you talk about Initiative 426. You know, that'll be great. That's part of the democratic process. We said, yeah, it'll just be a tree that falls in the forest and no one ever knows about it. We want something that goes into the official voter's guide. They didn't like that. But in Oregon, they thought, yeah, that actually makes sense. Because our Oregonians, they read the voter's guide. And Oregon, like Washington, is a vote-by-mail state. So we're actually sitting there filling out our ballot with our voter's guide right next to us, as a third of Californians voting absentee are and have been for a long time. In some sense, California was the forerunner there. And then finally, influential. It's not worth going to all the trouble of creating this if there isn't one of these things, either a direct queuing of vote choice, or maybe the statement helps you articulate your values. You have conflicting values, maybe on a proposition on mandatory minimum sentencing. Maybe reading that page helps you figure that out. Or it just presents information that goes beyond just a fiscal impact statement, and that information itself might help you make up your mind. So let's now evaluate the process and think about these three things I just said, right? Deliberative quality, visibility, and ultimately impact. So, the Oregon Citizens Initiative Review. Let me just say a couple words about it as we think about its quality. Again, it was passed by a House bill in 2009. They had the courtesy to pass that bill 1 month before the NSF deadline. But as the reviewer said, I was waiting for this to pass and had a research plan seriously ready to go. So we went in, and NSF in all its infinite wisdom said, what the heck? Let's go ahead and fund this. We kind of tried to put the screws on them and say, look, it's something that's going to appear and then disappear. You either fund it now or feel bad for the rest of your career. And they said, I will fund it now. So we'll take $50,000 off, work it out good. When the bill passed, it created something that had these basic elements. First, you collect a representative random sample of 24 Oregon voters, and this becomes your panel. Now, there's going to be 2 of these on 2 different issues. Each panel is a separate 24 people. They'll meet for 1 week in August. They just did this last year. They deliberate for that week, hearing the pro and con advocates and from neutral witnesses. I'll give you a little more sense of that in a minute. Then they write this citizen statement, 1-page statement that goes in the official voter's guide. And I'll show you the elements of that in just a minute. And then finally, again, voters use that to help themselves kind of figure out how to vote on an issue. That's basically all there is to the process. Now, there were 2 panels, as I said. The first one was on Measure 73, which would created new minimum sentences for felony sex crimes of a certain variety and drunk driving, repeated drunk driving. I'll throw you one interesting detail there. The kind of things that comes up in the deliberation is, so how many people commit felony sex crimes who are repeat offenders? And it starts getting actually kind of complicated. It turns out you're actually, by the law, a repeat offender if you're convicted on multiple offenses at your first trial. The first time you ever meet in the justice system, you could actually be a repeat offender and get the mandatory minimum. That's not who they meant, and the proponents were backpedaling in the middle of this process saying, that's not who we meant. Okay, legally that might be what it says and means, but that's not what we meant. The con side's kind of, well, what are you going to do? They said, well, but still, we really are concerned about the people who, come back and do it again, right after. Well, it turns out that in the last, several years in Oregon, there are 2 such people. This again, that was unrefuted by the pro side. These things come up. These things are problematic, right? That clearly you haven't thought through something, or you didn't know something, and you have an initiative on the ballot that we're voting on. Drunk driving, I'll get to a detail on that a little bit later. We're going to look more at Measure 73 than 74, just for economy's sake. And then the second week, these are the folks helping with the research. A couple graduate students first week, and Kathy Kramer-Walsh from Wisconsin, and then Katie Knobloch again. Both times, she's doing her doctoral dissertation on aspects of this process. 74 would establish dispensaries for medical marijuana. Oregon already had medical marijuana, 40,000 people licensed. They wanted to add some new regulations and so on. It was an interesting, very complicated initiative, and that was the second week.
So I have a question about this. How were those two selected of all the issues?
There weren't that many issues, actually. It's interesting. The medical marijuana, we did some early polling with some of our research money to actually give them an indication of which issues we thought might be worth studying. Because mandatory minimums was one we said, oh, don't even, whatever you do, don't do that issue.
Yeah.
That thing's polling like 4 to 1. You know, all the CIR could do is maybe make people think twice before they pass it, which they're going to do. Medical marijuana, we said that one's golden. You know, a lot of people are strong one way or the other, but they're evenly divided, and those in the middle are really unsure. There were other great issues that didn't qualify for the ballot. There was a bit of a surprise in Oregon at how few issues qualified. One that qualified about casinos, actually, the proponent said, please don't vote for this. This is a mistake. We had 2 initiatives, and we don't want this one passing by itself. I mean, so what are you going to do? You know, debate that? And then another one had no opposition, which is actually a bit of a challenge to get the opposition organized for it. So in the end, they were kind of stuck with 2, and they went with 2. And thank God they did these 2. They actually worked out wonderfully, as we'll see. So I just want to give you some visuals so you can see the process. They're sitting in a horseshoe. There's their facilitator. The first day is orientation to process. What is it we're doing? What are we doing here? How does this work? It's a dramatic thing for these folks. I mean, no one knows how to do this. And in fact, we didn't know how to do it. I say we. I just got to study it, which was quite a luxury. But the thing was so much smoother the second week, partly because they had panelists from week 1 come back and say, oh, now they're going to explain everything to you, but let me tell you, here's what you're really doing. Right? And everyone laughed, and it actually made perfect sense, because now everybody knew how this worked. Day 2, you start hearing from the pro and con sides, and they really get to put their arguments out there. What they're not accustomed to is sustained rebuttal and counter-argument, and needing to document everything. Because remember, that statement in the end contains all sorts of claims. Well, the citizens wanted all those claims to be substantiated. They didn't want to get anything wrong. So many of the things that were very important on the first day, big arguments that came out, just disappeared. Because there just wasn't really enough behind them to persuade the citizens that it was worth putting in that one-page statement. You start to hear from some other witnesses who aren't affiliated with one side or the other. The citizens have a big book of people who are available to come in by phone or in person, and they can kind of select and choose based on what they need to hear more about. This guy was fantastic. The air quotes is just the beginning of his gestures. But incredible statistics and things. Here's one. This one will knock your socks off. 97% of drunk driving convictions that involve a fatality were for first-time offenders. 97%. Wow, really? It just doesn't sound right. But, as he explains, normally you're not caught when you're drunk driving, right? And then it gets more complicated from there. Those who are getting caught repeated times know that they're drunk drivers and may behave differently from those who haven't yet been caught and may not quite have come to terms with the fact that they are driving drunk and could kill someone. It's kind of sort of fascinating detail comes up, and again, it's very relevant to the citizens and got into their deliberations. Thursday, the pro-con sides get a chance to try to pull things back together.
Are both sides there the whole time?
They can be. There are times when they absolutely don't have the floor, and they can't interact just at random with people. But if they're smart, they're sitting in the back of the room watching the whole thing. Week 4, the second week on medical marijuana, the proponents were very careful about that, being there for everything. They were crashing and burning in the middle of the week, but hung in there and started counter-arguing, coming up with great research and to fill in the gaps, and wound up getting a 13-11 vote in favor of them, and we'll get to what that vote means. This week, the mandatory minimums, the proponents tried to stay, but they were doing so badly and got so angry that they would disappear for long periods of time. On this day, when it was time for your final closing arguments, they were so mad they said, look, we can't refute all this nonsense the other side is saying, so we're going to show you a video. And it was 4 songs, 2 rock, 2 country, and some really gruesome footage of drunk driving related fatalities and things. And the citizens sat there and watched it respectfully for a little while, and then you could see them start to feel that they were being insulted. That this was just a straight out emotional feel. There was occasionally a statistic in the middle of the slideshow, but I swear the source would be in like 3-point font. It's unreadable. So and here's a claim, and here's another graphic image, and here's a claim, and here's another graphic image. Some of them left the room, and I kind of walked out there and just got curiosity. You have to be at an event like this to really know what's happening. And a couple of them were just ready to scream. They walked out of the room because they couldn't contain themselves anymore. They were so mad You know, they said they didn't have time. Well, they're wasting 15 minutes. They could be telling us whatever it is we need to know, and instead they're just showing us they were so mad because again they were here for a certain kind of process, and it was instead getting a sort of an extended soundbite, which had no place in their mind. Friday, they got to finish writing that statement and then have a press conference. You can see up on the wall there is some sort of high-tech aspect to this process, but there was a lot of sticking paper on the walls. One of the amazing things is if you're a proponent or an opponent watching this process, right up on the wall are, over the course of the week, the claims that they're starting to think are important. Oh, here's a factual claim the pro side made. We're going to write that down. We're going to put that on the wall. See if maybe there's some evidence for that. Well, you should be writing it down, pro side, right? You should be finding what the source is for that. Put that in their binder, Or if they start taking things off the wall, you can think, oh, why are they taking that off? All this information, it's kind of transparent in a beautiful sort of old technology way. And then the press conference where they present the results and so on. Had it just ended with a press conference, very little impact. I'll show you that more tangibly in a second. The voters guide is absolutely critical. So the press conference at the end, might as well not have happened. All right, so just a couple notes on process satisfaction and deliberation. We do a much more detailed analysis, qualitative principally, of the quality of the deliberation, but they loved it. They felt great about the process. Again, all but one person saying they were high or very high in their satisfaction with it. Did you have sufficient opportunity to express your views? Occasionally one or two people would say, I don't really feel that I did, but again, overwhelmingly, yeah. How about this? Did you have trouble understanding or following the discussion? Here we're just looking at measure 73, just for illustration. What I like about this is that you actually have a fair number of people saying Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, yeah, actually, I got a little confused. Yeah, I'm not quite, but then by the last day, this is all that really matters at the end. They're kind of saying, yeah, okay, I think I get it. Yeah, okay, I think I know enough, right? So I actually appreciate that confusion. I view that as honesty. And in the end, they're saying, I don't know everything. I'm not an expert. As the pro side said, this was a beautiful moment on measure 73, the mandatory minimums. He said, look, you can't understand this issue in 5 days. You have no legal training. I mean, this is crazy, this process. I mean, and the con side finally, on their last chance of rebuttal, said, maybe it's not a good idea for an initiative if that's true, right? I think there might be something you're missing here. These guys have 5 days to understand your issue. And if that's an insult to your initiative, well, then why is it an initiative? But yeah, they felt they knew enough. They knew enough, right? Okay. So the deliberation, again, I think it was of a high quality. And again, we have more detail on that in the report we gave to the legislature, which is available online if you want to see more. But was it visible? Remember, that press conference might as well not happen. Did people really find out about this? Well, there's the voters pamphlet. Here's an example of the page. Don't worry about not being able to read the text. I'm just showing you the sections here. That page that they could potentially see in their voters guide comes to them a few weeks before the election. Starts with a statement about what the CIR is, just a neutral description from the Secretary of State. And then these are the key 3 sections. This section right here is a statement of the majority of the panel, which is not pro or con, it's actually findings, pretty much empirical claims that it says how many voted for, like 19 out of 24 agree that the following is true. Here's an example. Measure 73 shifts the balance of power in court proceedings, giving the prosecution additional leverage in plea bargaining and limiting the judge's discretion in sentencing individual cases. That is exactly what it does. That's true as a matter of law. 21 out of 24 agree. So okay, as a voter, again, this is an influential voting. You can read this and maybe say, well, this is a credible process. I think I understand it. Now, does that make you want to vote for it or against it? Well, it depends on how much power you want the prosecutor to have. That's not what this is about. It's just telling you something important. And here's the opposition and then the in favor. So you actually, this is where the vote matters, where you split. And they split 21-3 against this measure. 21-3. This is a measure passing overwhelmingly at the time in Oregon. 21-3. The citizen panel says, oh no, this is awful. And conservatives, liberals, you name it. And here's the opposition side. So 21 out of 24 panelists agree with the following statements. And they just fire away with what they think are the best arguments. And then the pro side gets equal space. It doesn't matter if it's 3 people or 12 people. They get equal space here, what they think are the best arguments in favor. Again, the idea is that a voter doesn't just want to be told how to vote. They want to see what the best arguments are. Now, I think the absolutely golden thing about this process is, yes, you break into pro and con caucuses. And this is actually, when they write their arguments, it's the only part of the process that's not visible to the public. Sort of like jury deliberation. You write your pro arguments, you go write your con arguments. But then they have to come back together, and they have to present their arguments to the other side for critique. They don't get to all vote. The 21 people don't get to say, oh no, those aren't the best pro arguments. I'll give you some good pro arguments. No! No, they still get to do what they think is right, but they have to share it with their fellow citizens. And week 1 was very rushed, but corrected a gross factual error that was in these arguments. Week 2 had more leisurely process and was fantastic. Real subtle editorial changes. The law that was proposed, for instance, on Measure 74 would have, according to the critics of it, would have exempted all employees associated with dispensaries from all drug laws. That's close to true, believe it or not. What is true is would have exempted them from all laws relating to marijuana, all laws. That's still really important. And the con side was like, yes, you're right, it was marijuana laws. But you bet it's one of our arguments still. But thanks for the clarification, that's right. We overstepped a little. And there were lots of subtle edits like that both sides gave each other to make the arguments more accurate, right? So it was wonderful to see how collaborative that process was. Even though they had to divide on that 5th day, they were still really a group trying to work together. And then a shared agreement statement, which didn't really amount to much. It just sort of said we all held hands in a discussion. We'll work on that maybe the next time around, and I'll do something better with that. All right, so how aware were people of the process? Well, I dropped this little red arrow in here to point out that here's when the Voters Pamphlet arrives in the mail. Prior to that, the dark green, very aware, is roughly 1 in 10 Oregonians who really knew about this. Yeah, that CIR process, I've heard about that. And less than 1 in 3 had any idea that this thing had happened. Once the Voters Guide comes out, the total awareness shoots up to just over 40%. We still don't get to quite half the public. In other words, half of Oregonians could kind of make it through the whole election process and actually not know about this. Well, it's also almost half full. It's not actually half full, it's 42% full. But at least we do have a huge number of people in Oregon knowing about, learning about this. And again, it'll be right in front of their nose when they're filling out their ballot. Here's another stat that gives you an interesting sense for how things went in Oregon. You see that the mandatory minimums is polling at least 70% right up until kind of the end of the election, and there was not much of a funded opposition. Opposing mandatory minimums and these sorts of crime laws in Oregon is pretty much a lost cause. But you notice when the Voters Guide comes out towards the end, it does start to drop. And we'll see whether we have some more direct evidence of whether CIR played a role in it. Still passes, gets about 57% of the vote, but you can actually see towards the end of the election, it's actually polling worse for those people voting right towards the end. A fair number of people voting kind of right when they get their ballots, as things build up a little bit, it just keeps collapsing just in time to pass. And this is a rolling cross-sectional survey here done every week at the University of Washington. For Measure 74, the red line there, medical marijuana, it's much more kind of topsy-turvy. It actually ends up with about 44%. It was actually doing a little better towards the end, but it's hard to say, because at one point it was passing, and then it kind of collapses. This isn't direct evidence of impact one way or the other, but it gives you a sense for how these issues did in the course of the election. Okay, so people were exposed to these things, fine, but how much did they really read them? This is one of my favorite stats, is we were asking people how many minutes they spent with each section of the Voters Guide, and you can see it's quite dramatic how much more time they felt they needed to sit down with that CIR page than any two of these other elements combined. It was really something they felt actually required a little more time to read and study. And that makes sense, it's new, right? It's something you're not familiar with. But it has these interesting different elements that you kind of need to process, whereas the fiscal estimate, for instance, is very straightforward. The full text, who are you kidding? You can't read the full text, at least for one of these two initiatives. So you just kind of motor through these things. But the CIR, they really had to stop and think about. All right. So it had a decent quality of deliberation. It had some degree of visibility, right? Maybe our threshold of up to about 42%, though that's even only somewhat aware. But did it have influence? It did reach enough people that when we did these surveys, we did two different kinds of surveys. We're going to see the other one in a second. But we had plenty of Oregonians who were familiar with the CIR, or were exposed to it one way or the other. But before we get to those folks who actually did see it of their own accord, we had a wonderful opportunity because so many people hadn't yet heard about it, hadn't yet read their Voters Guide at the time of their survey. We did one of our surveys was done online using polymetrics, and we did a neat little experiment with this, where when you started this survey, you were asked a couple questions. Have you already voted? If you said no, you're in my experiment still. And then, have you read the voter's guide? No. Great, you're in my experiment. I then randomly assign you to one of 4 conditions. The first condition is nothing. You're then asked, hey, how would you vote on Measure 73? That's the one about mandatory minimum so-and-so. Right? That's the sort of no treatment. Second one gets the sort of pointless treatment, which is, here, stop for a second before I ask you anything else. Would you read this page? It's a letter from the Secretary of State telling you about the voter's guide. Completely irrelevant to what you're about to be asked. But, it has you read something. The third condition is quite relevant. It's the conventional sort of voter's guide content. It's, hey, here's the Attorney General's summary of Measure 73. Here's the fiscal statement. You done with those? Great. Okay, now let me ask you, how would you vote on that? Those are my first 3 experimental conditions. Think to yourself what different effects you might get for those 3 conditions. And if you guessed no effect, you're right on board. It doesn't matter which of those 3 you got, you're exactly the same. Remember, this thing was quite popular, right? So it's pulling overwhelmingly 2 to 1 even at this point, regardless of those 3 treatments. Well, you see where I'm going, don't you? What was that 4th random condition, right? It was the CIR statement that's in your voter's guide. And let me stress something here. I love experiments as much as the next person, but I really do. But I do sometimes get frustrated on some issues in some contexts. You can't just use a student population and say, hey, imagine that this thing were important and give me 30 minutes of your time. Sometimes that works, but for this kind of a thing, I don't think it does, because there's no real pressure to deliberate. There's no stakes. These are real voters who are about to vote. They really are. I mean, their ballots sitting on their coffee table. They care about these issues. They matter. It's a motivated experiment with real people. What happens when they read the CIR page? You ask them how they're going to vote on 73, and they say, oh, I don't think so. 25% shift. It's quite dramatic. This is the kind of result that those of you who do statistics can appreciate this. You delete your script and write it again and check to see what went wrong, right? And nothing did. It's just money. Hallelujah. It's dramatic. Again, we chose the 73 for the experiment because the panel was so strident in its critique of this particular measure. And sure enough, voters who are prepared to vote for it 2 to 1 really have second thoughts when they see that statement. There's a couple neat details I want to show you here, and this gets a little bit to what do people actually do with the voter's guide that's conventionally provided. Here's a question we asked right afterwards was, did you feel that you had heard enough information to really make up your mind on this issue? And I just combined the you get nothing and you get the Secretary of State's letter. Those are basically both nothing, and they have the same result. But whether you got that or the CIR statement, about 43, 46% of you say, yeah, I guess I'd heard enough, but a majority don't think they have. Those who read the fiscal statement, right, and the quick summary of the bill, they're, oh yeah, I know enough now. Sure I do, yeah. Remember, they're voting exactly the same as the people who didn't get that information. But now they feel much better about it. Look, 2/3 of them are like, that's all I needed, I'm good to go. And vote exactly the same as I would have had I not had that information. But try this second one. When we ask these survey questions about how would you vote as a surveyor, you often start with something like, would you vote for it or against it? Or are you not sure? And if they say not sure, what do? You hassle them, right? Oh, come on. Don't you lean one way or the other? Well, look what happens here. If you get the sort of no treatment, a majority of you are ready to say yes or no on the first response, right? If you get the CIR, you actually become more reluctant to give me an answer initially. What just happened? I just rocked your world, right? You were ready, 2/3 of you were ready to vote for it. You see the statement. Now, a lot of you are thinking, I'm going to have to vote against it. But your first response is, gosh, all of a sudden, I don't know. When I push you is when you say no. Now, again, if I give you just the fiscal statement, that green line, and I give you the simple description of the law, oh, yeah, I know how I'm going to vote. Absolutely. I know everything I need to vote exactly the same as I would have had you not given me that information. But I feel much more confident. I know my answer. So that voter's guide is the conventional form is just reinforcing your pre-existing beliefs. The CIR is shaking them, or at least it can. Let's try this a different way, because I wanted to get it impacted in a couple different approaches. The experimental one I love because of the sort of the causal power of experimental design and randomized control. But it's also nice to do kind of a regression, controlling for lots of variables in kind of the natural voting environment. What I mean by that is, here what I'm going to look at is whether you read the CIR statement on your own. not because I showed it to you in a web survey. This is the phone survey. And we ask you a gazillion questions, including, did you happen to read the CIR statement on that measure? And that's surely correlated with a few things. It's not correlated with as much as you think. Who reads it is pretty randomly distributed. It correlates with a couple things, so we control for those things, right? To try to get to what is the unique impact of reading that page on the dependent variable, which is how you want to vote. And it's logistic regression, right? Dichotomous dependent variable on for or against the measure. And with a quick little highlight, you can see what I'm driving at here. Let me translate this effect for you. So this is reading the CIR after controlling for some pretty conventional measures and things. Now, notice this little guy up here. Your values, we measure very initiative-specific values about things like punishment and civil rights and so on. These are driving your voting choice right here. This is a huge effect. In fact, so big it actually makes me kind of nervous. Talked to a couple colleagues about it, and we're not sure what to interpret at that level. It's like 52 times? No, that doesn't make sense. But this does make sense. This is basically 1 divided by 0.2. You're 5 times less likely to support that measure if you read that statement controlling for the other variables. 5 times less likely if you read that page. And this is an interesting interaction. Remember I said one of the potential effects is not just a voting cue, but values clarification. Well, in a sense, it's kind of the opposite. Your values actually become a little bit less predictive of how you're going to vote after you read the CIR statement, the interaction of your values and reading it, which actually warms my heart in the end, because I've come to realize that we kind of jumped the gun on values clarification. I don't think voters have any trouble saying, oh, my values are over there, they're over there. But that can be very simple-minded. I mean, if I'm tough on crime and there's an initiative to nuke the city of Portland, I'm for it. I mean, right, that's pretty tough. There's crime. No, of course I'm not for it, because there's value conflicts and there's, oh, right. So maybe I need to back up and think about the actual empirics of the measure. And it's a bit of a silly example, but Measure 73 was incredibly expensive. That money can be spent on lots of other things that, if you like, are tough on crime. So now how do you vote, right? The CIR raises these kind of questions and in a sense disentangles your values from a simple-minded quick vote on any measure. Well, with Measure 74, medical marijuana, we actually see that roughly the same size of effect. Again, 5 times less likely if you read that statement. Now, it's interesting, when you look at the statement, I mentioned before, right, that actually 13 of the 24 panelists voted for it and wrote the pro-arguments. But look at the very first empirical finding that they have in their key findings section. The language of this measure lacks clarity in every respect. That's something they almost all agreed on, for or against. And when you read it, you kind of get the sense that maybe 13 out of 24 is not very good. I mean, should we pass a measure if it's kind of 50-50? No. And so that's actually really reassuring to me. I mean, if a 13 out of 24 vote got you guaranteed passage of your initiative, Lord help us. I mean, at some point we have a group of 24 people that, sure, it's stratified, random and all that, but it's just 24 people. If 21 out of 23 say it's a bad idea, I've got a little margin of error there around that 21. I'm feeling good about that. 13? No. And I love that the Oregon voters, at least statistically it seems, are saying, that's not impressive. I look at the actual content and I'm inclined to vote against it. The interactions, again, we're looking at a couple different things here, but they're trending in the same direction. Again, they're weakening the connection between your values and the vote if we want to take it that far. All right. Knowledge gains, I'll just say a quick word here. We haven't actually been able to connect these knowledge gains to the change in vote preferences, but you can see they understand things better about the issues. They understand Measure 73 would apply to minors, which it wasn't meant to, but it kind of does. A few other things. Measure 74, interestingly, the factual things they come to believe are all kind of the things you believe if you were supporting Measure 74. So it may be, and this one is in red because this is the one change in factual belief that wasn't well established in the course of the process, and it wasn't in the CIR statement exactly. But we can talk about how you could actually come to conclude that, even though the statement wasn't pushing you towards it. It's kind of implicit. But it doesn't seem to help the pro side very much to get these things across. Maybe they're just straightforward and again, aren't determinative of your vote choice when you take other considerations into account. So the clearest pathway to influence isn't necessarily knowledge gains. It may simply be the aggregate of causing you to think about a wider range of considerations than factual statements really can bring to bear. All right, some final reflections here. There's all sorts of research we want to do with this in terms of thinking about the process itself, the role of expertise, emotion, and so on. Thinking about how this process disrupts some of the conventional ideological biases and filters that people use when they're voting. And we also have a wonderful data set to look at initiatives more generally now. But as a practical insight, it is probably critical to use better publicity to reach the public in a process like this. The voter's guide itself isn't even enough. And for those of you who study argumentation and so on, we actually think this process needs a more rigorous preparation for the pro and con advocates. I feel a little bad for the sides in both issues that just did a terrible job because they didn't know how to make a sustained argument in a public setting. That should not be determinative of the advice that this panel gives to fellow voters. That should just tell you, you need to shape up. But we should help you. This is a new process, and frankly, it's kind of sad, but I think it's clear from the Oregon CIR that political advocates are not accustomed to that level of responsibility for public discourse. So let's cut them a little slack and help them out a bit. I promised you I would come back to where this thing is at. So the Oregon legislature, as it happens, that same election that CIR took place, they wound up with a split legislature. Half Democratic, half Republican. Perfectly split. They're going to do co-chairs for the first time in their history. And the co-chairs of the House, the Democrat and the Republican, are both co-sponsors of the renewal legislation for the Oregon CIR. I have to say, as an academic, it was a moving experience to testify to the legislature. Their gratitude for us having done the research, which they did not fund, was tremendous. They had the highest respect for the National Science Foundation. They felt honored to have been studied. Not themselves personally, which they would not have liked, but a process they had created. And they took the information very seriously, and more than one came up to the couple activists I told you before who kind of lobbied for this and said, look, I was really on the fence on this. I told you I don't want to spend energy on this if it doesn't really matter, but that's pretty compelling evidence that it mattered. The voters used this, that they found it interesting, and I think it can only get better as we move forward. So again, it's gratifying to get the rare opportunity as an academic for Katie Knobloch, the doctoral student, who's actually testifying there again on Wednesday. They've reconstituted their committees, and if she needs to go again, I'll be in Australia. But it's an incredible opportunity for her, too, to really get to see how important our research, our work can be. Both qualitative and quantitative is involved here in really helping policymakers think through questions that have important empirical elements about how things actually function. Do we really deliberate? Does it influence the larger public? So I appreciate the opportunity you've given me to share this information. I look forward to any questions you have, and in the time we've held up, I hope you use them. Thank you very much. Please, yes, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I have a couple of just questions about details.
Sure.
So first of all, what's the general cost for this? In terms of how much it costs the state to put together the citizens initiative, bringing people in, all of that.
Let's do that quickly. And that's bingo. That's why it passed in Oregon. Paid for by nonprofits. Paid for through a nonprofit contributions to Healthy Democracy Oregon. That's what got through the Oregon legislature versus Washington, and that's how they're renewing it. Now, in the long term, not clear that that's sustainable. But anywhere between $100,000 and $200,000 to really put on a professional week. So, twice that for 2 weeks. If you're going to do every initiative on the ballot, it's going to add up. Now, we always say weigh that against the cost of these initiatives. What's at stake here? Tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. It's jump change, right? But for the legislature, it passed because they didn't have to pay for it, especially in this climate.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. And then the other question was about accuracy checks. And one of the things that you mentioned is that there was an error that was caught about the right. But what I was wondering is, in terms of when the pro and the con sides are presenting their arguments,
yeah.
And of course, and they may or may not be accurate because people are who are presenting may be trying to influence facts using the arguments.
Sure.
And so I'm wondering, what is the fact-checking process?
Sure. The fact-checking process is pretty straightforward, which is both sides are making claims, and they ultimately have to back that up with something, depending on the nature of the claim. If it's a claim, if it's a legal interpretation of a bill, they want to give you their analysis of the language of the bill and how it fits that interpretation. And basically, they're looking at the other side. Are you going to refute that? And if they refute it persuasively, it's kind of a non-starter. Usually when both sides went at it on an issue, just didn't make it into the statement. Citizens were not satisfied that either side had it right. Sometimes both sides would go at it, but only one side would really have much of a foundation for it. Such as, for instance, does mandatory minimums deter crime? Yeah, there was actually a bit of evidence that it really doesn't, and there was no evidence that it does. So that actually made it in on one of the arguments. At the same time, there was a subtle enough distinction that one of the pro-arguments that was let through was mandatory minimums do reduce crime through increased incarceration, right? Lock everyone up and there's less crime. That's true. Those are both true. And that's one of the things I love about that statement, is they're both in there. That was kind of a subtle reconciliation of what were conflicting views, but they're not really. They're actually different claims. Now, I said there was one thing that voters who read the statement came to believe, that is that lots of people are having to go to the black market to get their marijuana. It is actually not in the statement, but somehow reading the statement seemed to cause people to think that. It's interesting. That was a claim that the pro side tried to make, but it couldn't really make, because there wasn't compelling evidence that people were running off to the black market to get their medical marijuana. But when you read the statement, you definitely get the sense that there's a tremendous need for this dispensary law, that people can't get their pot. And it leaves the implication that they might have to go to the black market, which isn't said, but voters seem to infer. So even if you carefully sort of fact-check each other through the process and you write your statement, there can be implicature that maybe wasn't intended.
Right.
Yeah?
I've got two questions. One is just in terms of thinking about sampling people for these groups, is there much work towards kind of the cognitive diversity of the kind of group in addition to kind of stakeholder diversity? There's a lot of different ways you could do that sampling. And then the second...
For the 24 citizens.
Exactly.
Let's do that one and come back to part two. So it's tricky. You can do demographics straight up, and you can do political party. Well, when you start sampling for things like, so are you already, day one, are you in favor of Measure 73 or opposed, or any number of things, strategic behavior could slip right in there. And so, Ned Crosby, I said, has been doing citizen jury since the 70s, and he's gone back and forth on this issue and come down on the side of, you know what, I'm going to do demographic diversity. And a neat thing he does with the citizens jury is he gets an advocate from both sides in the room, puts up a board with about 60 people and says, let's find 24 people we can all agree on. It's like voir dire, right, in a courtroom almost. And you get a pretty, he has to meet certain demographic quotas, right, you want to get, but it also has to make both sides feel like they're not, getting a crazy sample. Part two.
Part two, how much of the problem is the articulation versus the making sense of things? So I understand a lot of this is focused on sense-making, two sides, hearing all the evidence, but so much of making decisions and voting is about kind of the framing. You talked about values briefly, but there seems like you could spend 9/10 of your time on just how do we articulate these final sentences in a certain way. Is there a discourse that's presumed of kind of rationality if we just the facts and nothing but the facts, or do we ever talk about tough on crime, or do we try to not use phrases that are kind of these key phrases to tie into values? In other words, how much of the training do you think is deserved to spend on that endpoint, helping people articulate things in a certain way?
Let me answer this in two parts, sort of backwards. Let's start with the end, which is they have to write a statement, and it's getting late on Thursday. They have to end the day, and then Friday they're going to know they're going to be rushed. How are they going to get these darn things hammered out grammatically? And there's framing implications, sure, but it's also just how do you say it in a way that the voter will understand. And both weeks, somebody on the panel would at some point say, I think this sounds like something someone would write if they'd studied this for 5 days. I'm not sure if we stepped back, we would actually know what we just said.
Right.
And that was great that they had that awareness, and that should really definitely be coached to make sure they hit that point. But they worked hard to work out the language, and in both cases there would be a group that overnight would take the things that they had up on the board and try writing them out, and then kind of bring a package of proposals the next day. In other words, they would work through a fair bit of wordsmithing, and it's pretty innocuous stuff, but it's kind of important. That is, there weren't really big framing questions at that point. It's more when you get into the pro and con arguments that things start to get loaded up, and the values framing start really coming in strongly. Now, that gets me to part two of my answer, which is, if you looked at our full sort of report card on how the process did, we give worst grades for values consideration. The process kind of dances around it a little bit. They sort of say, what are the key issues on this Measure 73? What are the key? Well, they mean, I think, values, but it's very confusing. And that kind of winds up organizing the empirical claims that they start working with and the arguments. But in the end, their arguments wind up looking like empirical claims. You don't get the stronger sort of value arguments that I would have expected to find in the pro and con sides, because they just didn't work with that kind of discourse as much.
Right.
And I think that's a reflection of two things. One, it was kind of an accident. That part of the process they just haven't thought through as much, the designers. But it was also kind of intentional because they really wanted to emphasize information. You don't want to go to the legislature and say, we've got a great process that will, be a test of wills, of clash of cultures. And no, you want voters to be more informed, right? You want them to better understand the issue. And so that's really where it focuses its energy and does a very good job. But I think maybe it can back up a little and bring the values in a more meaningful way, and maybe have a little bit of the best of both worlds.
Oh, and maybe it's more of a clarification question. So
Sure.
for the pros and cons part, you didn't disclose the number, right? Like how many people?
It did, actually.
did?
Yeah, 21 against 3.
Right.
Yeah.
So my question then is, so there are many aspects of this presentation of this IR card. And one side is you present the tags, and the other is the numbers. And I wonder if that might actually be some kind of anchoring effect, given that you give people these numbers, and then people just look at this number and do a calculation probability, and I trust these guys, and they just go ahead.
Well, but yeah, again, by that logic, we can't explain why Measure 74, reading that statement, turned people against it. Because, right, it was 13 to 11 in favor.
Oh, okay.
I'm with you, and we asked a specific question, which was, we asked them various things about the page to try to see what they remembered and understood. And one of the questions was, so how did they vote on this? Do you remember how they split? They tend to get it right, but I haven't finished the analysis of this, but you can look at the crosstabs, it's very straightforward. Yeah, they tended to get it right, but when they got it wrong, they got it wrong in the same direction they voted. So if I voted in favor of Measure 73, there's an unfortunate possibility that I may actually think that's how the 21 to 3 against panel also voted. And vice versa. For medical marijuana, you can imagine, it's split 13 to 11. Your mind wanders easily 2 or 3 more votes in one direction or the other. And most people said, honestly, I don't remember. So part of the reason I haven't made more out of that is that actually it's a small subset of the people who said they read it can actually remember with confidence what the vote split was, which surprised me. But it suggests that that simple cue isn't necessarily working in such a powerful way. One possibility is, and we don't know this until we have more of these to chew through in future years, but one possibility is that on Measure 73, yeah, 21 to 3 against, yeah, that mattered. People saw that and thought, holy smokes. But maybe it only mattered to make them stop and think, right? They didn't then just blindly follow it because they were already planning to vote in the other direction. And then on Measure 74, I have a feeling the 13 to 11 vote made people think, oh, well, that's not helpful. What did they say? So they turned to what they said for a different reason. Not because they've been shocked and now need to understand how they could possibly disagree, but just because they didn't get enough information from the 13 to 11 split.
Thank you for the studies. They're fascinating. I was wondering if you thought about what the implications of finding public advocates who didn't know how to do extended deliberations, what that does for a deliberative democracy paradigm. If you find in practice people called on, they know it's important, they have beliefs, but they just don't know how to extend their arguments.
2 answers. One, it makes, I mean, by popular demand, it has been called a very cynical book. Yeah, I think I was right. That's what it said. They don't have to argue. They don't have to really argue in the sense an argumentation course would mean the word, right? They don't. It's not necessary to win a campaign. That kind of sustained argument with refutation, not necessary. So why would I be skilled at it, right? There's a second take, though, which is let's give these guys a break. Imagine you're in Oregon, you've written an initiative, or worse yet, you're an unformed opposition, right? You haven't really crystallized yet. This thing just qualified for the ballot. And these bozos tell you about the CIR process. You got to participate in this. It's going to be in the voter's guide. It's really exciting. It's really important. You can have 2 reactions. One is, what? I guess I'll show up. I mean, all right. The other reaction is, uh-oh, geez, what is this? What are you doing? No! That's not how we, so there's confusion and frustration. Now, year 2, right, they do this every 2 years, which I love in Oregon. They get 2 years to kind of digest it. And we have heard that from some campaign managers are some of the most critical people of this process. Because they're just going, oh, what do I do now? What's that? What am I supposed to do with that? Well, I'll tell you what they should do. They should do deliberative focus groups, right? Seriously, before the initiative is drafted, they should start testing it out with deliberative bodies. That's not the worst implication, people. That's not such a bad thing if your initiatives have to be sort of vetted by a deliberative focus group. But I guess 2 years from now, if they're just as ill-equipped, then my cynical side says, oh, I was really right. Not only were they not prepared, they can't be prepared. They just can't help themselves, right? I don't think that's the case. I actually think they'll be much better prepared. I think it's not quite the fear of God, because on either of these measures, I don't think it changed the outcome. If you look at how the election was going, it looks like medical marijuana failed worse than it would have, and the mandatory minimums passed by a narrower margin than it would have, but neither changed. But that's just a matter of time. I've always said that a process like this will break all your ties. You know, this will determine the outcome of the election if it's otherwise a toss-up, and by a significant margin, right? So if you're running a campaign, unless you think you've just got it in the bag, or it's just hopeless and you're just giving public speeches to raise awareness, you've got to care about this thing, and I think you will be prepared. Now, at that point, we look at the transcripts and say, oh my God, they did it again. They had no evidence, they were unprepared, they could put nothing in their binder, they didn't look at what was up on the wall. Then it's just like, oh my God, these are incompatible cultures, political campaigns and public deliberation.
Yeah, if you could discover a learning process over time.
Oh, what learning?
A learning process, the better ability to modify, articulate, and lay argument or present advocacy. That would be important.
And I think you will.
Because we assume it, but just to show it, to develop.
Yeah, well, some of us assume it. I've managed campaigns. Both my parents have run unsuccessfully for Congress. Made them a bumper sticker once that said, "We're Democrats and we run for Congress." But that'll pull you over. I'm in San Diego. The point is. The point is that I've seen campaigns from the inside, and if I was a campaign manager and I heard about a process like this and all it was a press conference, I would say, I'm sorry, I can't even attend. It doesn't matter. It's not consequential to the outcome of my election, and I have a professional responsibility to only bring my candidate and campaign's attention to those things that affect the bottom line. This affects the bottom line. If I'm a campaign manager, I might not like it because it changes the rules, and I'm professional, and I'm good at what I do, and I'm not sure how to handle this. But I'd better tool up. I'd better learn, as you say, and I will, and I'm confident you will. If you don't, you're a bad campaign manager, frankly. You've got to know how to handle this. And I don't think you can handle it in the sense that you spin and do a dance, because it's 5 days long. It really is. And we saw some of that, certainly in these 2 weeks, and it always went badly. It went very bad. I mean, at one point on mandatory minimums, the pro side brought forward its victims of violent sexual crimes and someone who lost a family member to a drunk driver, right? Here are my victims. This important legislation is very important to these people. What did the con side do? God bless them. They brought up their victims of the same crimes, not literally the same incident, but same kind. And they said, yeah, this isn't a law I would support. I had that same experience, and I don't think this is the right. Where do you go from there as the pro side? Well, later in the week they said, well, those aren't real victims. I mean, they don't represent victims' rights. I can tell you, I've seen them at other hearings. They don't speak on behalf of victims. That's your argument? Well, it is kind of. It's just, you kind of have to lay it out there. In a TV ad, you can imply that, right? You can kind of undermine the credibility of the other side. When you say it right in front of these 24 people sitting in the horseshoe, they look at each other and say, did I hear what I thought I just heard? Are you kidding me? We'll see you tomorrow, good luck. Yeah.
Drew, last question.
Just sort of building on what Tom said, and I think there was a panel at NCA on some of these issues. Andre actually was there, and someone presented the Walmart. You remember that? When they presented the deliberations over whether to build a Walmart in Lawrence, Kansas.
Yes.
And there was a learning process, but not maybe in the way that we would hope, which was Walmart had been defeated at a town hall meeting 5 or 10 years prior, and they came back with a learned strategy, and that strategy was not, as we might hope, to present reasons and evidence, but they had a unified set of talking points and a way of bringing the discourse back to their talking points, and just sort of repeatedly hammered it over and over again. And I can envision having gone to pro-healthcare rally at UCLA, then there were clearly, from what I could tell, Republican Party paid operatives there to dispute with us, and they were very well trained and they knew exactly what to do, which was to just keep saying the same thing over and over and over and it never break. And I could see if this process becomes actually as influential the way we might hope, I say, well, I have a lot of money at stake in this. I'm going to pay my lobbyists to argue in a different way to be persuasive. So how might that be accounted for or deterred? Or?
Well, at some point the courtroom analogy applies, right? Is that we want both sides to have the resources necessary to make the best arguments they can. If we think that will reach some sort of indecisive equilibrium, that is, both sides will essentially argue each other into the ground and everyone on the 24 panel will say, I don't know what to do. Maybe, that's an empirical question, but will that come to pass? I don't think it will. I think there are inconvenient facts on all of these issues, and you can only dance around them so much. I mean, at some point, you actually have to show me that mandatory minimums are a deterrent if you want that claim to stick. You can pull your study out of Boston College out of your pocket, but if you're not careful, someone's going to look at it. In particular, the other side, right? There's definitely a role for expertise here. These 24 citizens, they have a little bit of expertise here and there, but they're basically counting on these neutral background witnesses and the pro and con advocates to kind of sort each other out a little bit and see what at the end of the day is in the packet without a red line through it. I think it's a great question. I mean, what will happen in the end? Will people be hoodwinked? You know, I think when that time comes, if that happens sooner or later, that a panel winds up with a really bad statement, I think it will mean that one side of the issue completely fell down at the job.
Right.
And that's something the process can't
You
control.
set up the opposition is a key, yeah.
Well, and the opposition is probably where it would happen if something went off the rails. Because again, the pro side already exists. They created the initiative. The con side has to be assembled.
Right.
So one of the practical suggestions we had for the legislature was to push this process back a couple weeks, give a little bit more time to get the opposition together. And we need to start contacting people before these things qualify for the ballot, long before. In Oregon, they tried that this year. But again, when you're contacting people weeks in advance about something that's never happened before, you don't really have their attention. Hopefully in the future they would. But you know, if you believe in normal distributions, and I do, it's only a matter of time until one of these goes terribly wrong. You know, I feel bad saying that because I really do believe in this process, but just because you believe a process is better than the alternative doesn't mean you think it always works. Thank you so much.
Thank you.